Here's a story about pirates you'll never see in movies or video games. In 1695, a massive fleet of 25 ships belonging to the Mughal Empire was sailing from Mecca back to India when they were ambushed by pirates. Everyone knew that Mughal ships would be laden with enough gold and jewels to make you one of the richest men in the world, but they were also heavily guarded with hundreds of soldiers and cannons. Only one man was insane enough to actually attack them head on: the pirate captain Henry Avery. Avery's eye was on the jewel of the Mughal fleet, the Ganj-e-Sawai, a 1600-ton vessel containing more treasure than practically any ship on earth. For several days, Avery and his crew chased down the Mughals, and just when it seemed like they might reach India, the pirates caught up with them. The ensuing battle lasted 3 hours. The Mughal cannons exploded, the crew of the Ganj-e-Sawai panicked, and the pirates managed to board the ship and slaughter the soldiers on board. Over the next few days, the pirates looted the ship, tortured the men, and raped the women before they released the few survivors to return to India. All told, Henry Avery and his crew stole more than 600,000 pounds worth of treasure, which in today's money is nearly $500 million. This was the single biggest haul in history and made Avery the richest pirate in the world. And then, he just disappeared, like a ghost. The British launched a global manhunt to find him and bring him to justice, but no one, even to this day, knows where he went. And just like that, Henry Avery became a legend, a symbol for sailors all over the world who'd been abandoned by their countries and were desperate to avoid poverty, slavery, and starvation. I want to explore the frankly bonkers history of pirates in the 18th century Caribbean and how a war in Europe created the infamous Pirate Republic in the Bahamas, and how it was just as quickly destroyed by imperial forces. And with the release of the Assassin's Creed Black Flag remake, I thought it would be fun to see how historically accurate the game is and where reality was actually way crazier than fiction. Let's look at the true story of the Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm sorry, I had to do it. You know I had to do it, right? To figure out why the Caribbean became such a hotbed for piracy, we have to first understand where those pirates even came from. Really quick recap of what was going on in Europe. Basically, Britain, France, Spain, and the Dutch were constantly at war with each other, and wars are expensive. So instead of spending millions to expand their navy and hire more sailors, they had an idea. What if we permit private ship captains to go out on their own ships, attack merchant vessels belonging to the enemy, and then let them loot those enemy ships? This was called privateering, and it was basically a proxy war disguised as state-sanctioned robbery. The thing is, all of these European countries were getting rich from their colonies in North and South America. So if privateers could intercept merchant ships crossing the Atlantic, they could actually damage the rival kingdom's economy. And in fact, your kingdom could actually make some money by charging the privateers a small commission on whatever they looted. And this was big business. For context, a sailor in the Royal Navy earned a salary of 12 to 15 pounds a year. On the other hand, a single privateer was capable of spending 750 pounds in just one night of binge drinking at a tavern in Jamaica. There was simply no contest. Sailors were tripping over themselves to join privateering expeditions, and the government was happy to receive their 10% commission for allowing them the privilege. Things really came to a head in the Spanish War of Succession, when more and more British privateers were encouraged to attack Spanish ships that were transporting slaves, gold, and sugar to and from the Caribbean. Even the Royal Navy was recruiting soldiers like crazy. Groups of men called press gangs would literally go around the streets of major cities, find able-bodied men, and just drag them to the docks where they'd be forcibly recruited into the Navy. Between 1701 and 1714, the islands and port cities of the Caribbean were crawling with British and French Navy sailors and privateers, whose sole job was to make the lives of Spanish merchants difficult. Edward Kenway, the protagonist of Black Flag, would have been one of those men, hoping to make his fortune in the wartime privateering business.
I want food that don't make me sick. I want walls that hold back the wind. I want a decent life.
But in 1715, something shocking happened. A peace treaty was signed between the Spanish, French, and the British, bringing an end to the war. All of a sudden, there was no need for all those mariners who dedicated the last decade of their lives to fighting the Spanish. Sailors were let go en masse from the Royal Navy. The Queen of England totally banned privateering, leaving hundreds of buccaneers with no source of income and expensive ships to maintain. Now, here was the problem. Most of these men had only one job prospect, working in the merchant marine where they'd transport cargo between Europe and the Americas. The conditions on these ships was abysmal. There was never enough food or water, hygiene was terrible, and the wages were barely enough to survive on. Their only two options were unemployment and starvation, or a terrible job that paid next to no money. But that's when a switch flipped. What if there was a third option? One that wasn't legal, but paid better and gave them the freedom to choose their own path. All of them had heard stories about Henry Avery's legendary sacking of the Ganges Sawai, and the prospect of making a fortune plundering Spanish treasure fleets was intoxicating. They knew how to fight, how to sail, and many of them had their own ships. So if the Queen wasn't going to give them permission to loot and plunder, they were just gonna do it anyway. The Age of Piracy was born. The event that properly kick-started the pirate gold rush was a hurricane that hit the Caribbean in 1715, decimating a Spanish treasure fleet carrying a huge cargo of gold coins. This became a beacon for thousands of sailors and privateers, all hoping to get themselves a piece of the sunken treasure. Now that these men had chosen a life of crime, they were basically free to join any pirate crew that was willing to go out into the Caribbean in search of their fortunes. Now this is where we see our famous cast of rogues, our cabal of pirate captains who managed to seize power at the end of the war and command their own ships. Our first mastermind is Benjamin Hornigold, a man with a mysterious past who suddenly appeared as the captain of a pirate crew. What's funny is that even though his whole job was to, rob people, he was still a patriot and he refused to attack British or Dutch ships. His crew got so sick of his rules that they mutinied and kicked him out. So in 1718, when the King of England offered a royal pardon to all pirates, Hornigold took the pardon and even accepted the government's offer to become a pirate hunter who had to track down other pirates and bring them to justice. But Hornigold had a young protege, a man named Edward Thatch, whose career took a very different turn. You probably know him by his alias, Blackbeard. For merchants crossing the Atlantic, the sight of Blackbeard on his ship would have been terrifying. He wore dark clothes, sported a bristling beard, and lit slow-burning matches that he hung from his hat, giving him a smoky, demonic halo like he'd emerged straight out of hell.
And men will drop to their knees, pleading for their lord before all else.
But that was precisely his tactic. Blackbeard actually hated violence and tried to capture ships purely by intimidation and fear. And he seemed to genuinely care about his crew. At one point, he blockaded the city of Charleston in South Carolina and held people hostage for an entire week just to get a chest of medical supplies to treat syphilis among his crew. Then there was Sam Bellamy, or Black Sam, a penniless sailor who rose to the position of captain and saw himself as a sort of pirate Robin Hood and only stole from rich merchants. You had Stead Bonnet, a wealthy plantation owner who had a mental breakdown and abandoned his wife and estate to become a gentleman pirate. There was Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the famous female pirates who managed to escape dreary lives in the Bahamas and started looting ships with their crew. And Charles Vane, the most brutal and violent pirate of them all, infamous for torturing prisoners and abusing his own men. One of the most famous pirates was Bartholomew Roberts, or Black Bart, who was forced into piracy when his ship was captured, but was such a brilliant leader that he was voted to become captain of his ship. He even created a list of rules for pirates called the Pirate Code, which was strictly enforced among his crew. All these pirates got together on the islands of the Bahamas, where they envisioned a much grander future for piracy in the Caribbean. A republic of pirates, their own sovereign nation, free from the hegemony of the kingdoms in Europe, free from strict laws and taxes. The idea was that this would be a safe haven for pirate crews who wanted to repair their ships, sell their loot to traders, get some much needed rest and entertainment before heading out again for more expeditions. The pirate life was far more egalitarian than anything they experienced in the Navy. The crew of a ship could vote on who would be their next captain, looted treasure would be equally shared among crew members, and strict rules were enforced to prevent theft or violence on board the ship. This was the promise of the pirate republic that you see in Nassau in Assassin's Creed Black Flag. In the game, the pirates and residents of Nassau were engaged in a rebellion against the powers of Europe, a noble act of defiance against the colonial empires that were exploiting the Caribbean. There were good pirates like Blackbeard and Kenway who opposed slavery and colonialism, and bad pirates like Hornigold who were racist imperialists. But the reality was far less dramatic. By the way, if you're enjoying this so far, it makes a big difference if you can like this video, get subscribed, and share the video with your friends and family. It really helps me keep making more in-depth documentaries like this. Now back to the Caribbean. Look, pirates just wanted to make money. That's it. Some of them may have pretended to fight for a political cause, but in the end, it all came down to how much treasure they could loot before dying, getting caught, or if they were really lucky, making a fortune and disappearing like Henry Avery. Even the famous pirate republic in Nassau was just a lawless shanty town, populated by prostitutes, smugglers, and drunken vagrants. Instead of buildings and houses, you'd see mostly tents, huts made with driftwood, and temporary trading houses. There was never any real attempt at forming a government, and even if there were, it would have drowned in anarchy before it could even begin. To be honest, as bad as it was to be a sailor in the Navy, being a pirate wasn't that much better. Since you're an outlaw in Europe and most of the European cities established in North and South America, all that money you made looting ships was useless anywhere except for a few pirate-infested islands. Since they couldn't really save up or invest their money in a business, most pirates just went on massive spending sprees, emptying their purses on alcohol, prostitutes, and more alcohol. Even when they were out at sea, if their ship needed repairs or fresh supplies, they couldn't just stop at any port they liked. They had to seek out a pirate-friendly settlement that let them stop for a few days. This is why pirates had to be super careful about everything. How much food and water they had, who had fallen sick, what needed fixing on the ship, what the weather would be like tomorrow. Someone online said that pirates were basically accountants with cannons. The grand ship battles in Black Flag look really cool and are super fun to play, but no pirate in their right mind would go out seeking a fight. Armed conflict would be your last resort because battles cost you the lives of crew members, damaged your ship which was super expensive to repair, and it made you a bigger target for naval warships which are hunting down pirates. Because remember, most pirate ships were small to medium size, so they could be fast and maneuverable, but they didn't stand a chance against a real naval warship, armed with hundreds of guns and built to absorb heavy damage. One bad fight and they'd be finished. Then there's the diseases. Nutrition was basically non-existent on 18th century ships, so sailors got scurvy, they contracted a buffet of STDs during their island debaucheries, and got malaria, cholera, and dysentery. In fact, pirate crews would go in search of ships with a doctor on board, just to force him to join their crew and perform surgeries on injured sailors. Of course, things could always be worse. You could be an African slave in the Caribbean. Remember how I said Assassin's Creed Black Flag treats some characters as the good pirates who oppose slavery and the bad pirates who support it? Now, it is true that sometimes pirate captains who attacked a ship carrying slaves from Africa would liberate them and allow them to join their ranks. Many pirate fleets had 20 to 30% of their crew comprising former slaves. There was even one rare case where 98% of a ship's crew were runaway slaves who had chosen a life of piracy. But that didn't mean the European pirates had some soft spot for Africans. They tended to prefer slaves who'd been born in the West Indies because they knew European languages and could easily communicate. If a black crew member caused problems, captains would threaten to sell them back to their plantations as slaves. More often than not, if they captured a ship sailing from Africa, they'd just take the slaves for themselves and sell them for a hefty profit on the black market. Even if they retained some of them on board, they'd still treat them like slaves anyway. In fact, that's exactly what Blackbeard did when he captured a slave ship. So Kenway's friendship with Adewale isn't technically unrealistic, but there's no way Blackbeard and him would ever be chilling together sipping beers on a beach. But the golden age of piracy wasn't to last. The slave trade and sugar industry were simply too lucrative, and the British Crown couldn't afford to lose any more business to these marauding thugs. Even back in 1698, Britain passed a law that would allow local British courts in the Caribbean to convict and even execute pirates without needing to bring them back to London. But the Piracy Act of 1721 was even more brutal. From then on, even civilians who did business with pirates would face criminal charges and the threat of execution. Now, even the black market networks that supported piracy were actively drying up, making it harder and less lucrative to be a pirate. But none of this would mean anything if the laws weren't strictly enforced, and there was just one man the British government trusted to get the job done. Woodes Rogers, one of the main villains in Assassin's Creed Black Flag, was a former privateer turned pirate hunter who was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1718. But unlike his evil imperialist persona in the game, in real life, he was quite sympathetic to the circumstances of the pirates. He knew they were poor, desperate men with no other way to earn a living. So when he offered the king's pardon in 1718, he was giving them a way out of the pirate life and back into civilized living. But he wasn't exactly welcomed into Nassau. When he first arrived, he was attacked by Charles Vane. Then his crew contracted some horrible disease in their first few days on the island. The Royal Navy abandoned Rogers in Nassau, leaving his men defenseless. And he found that the locals there would rather drink all day than do an honest day's work, even when offered money. But he eventually got a handle on things. The king's pardon was successful in driving a wedge between pirates who wanted to quit and the ones who wanted to stay. And he was able to enlist men like Hornigold to hunt down the pirates that refused clemency.
Look on this as a stroke of fortune, lads. We should take the king's pardon and salvage what dignity we own.
I'll be hanged before I surrender to that poppy.
People realized he really meant business when he executed 8 well-known pirates in just one afternoon. Over the next few years, the biggest names in Caribbean piracy fell like dominoes. Blackbeard was killed in a battle with the Royal Navy in 1718. Sted Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, was hanged that same year. Calico Jack, Anne Bonny and Mary Read were captured off the coast of Jamaica in 1720. Charles Vane was found marooned on an island and executed in 1721. Black Bart was killed in another battle with the Royal Navy in 1722. By 1725, the number of pirates sailing the oceans had dropped by 90%. Most of the men who had terrorized the Caribbean had now fled to the coast of West Africa, where they struggled to make a living and were trapped by the fact that they couldn't go back to Europe. Meanwhile, the Caribbean islands transformed from an unregulated frontier territory to a highly controlled and heavily fortified part of the empire. And the colonial exploitation of sugar plantations turned the islands into an economic engine supporting Britain's booming industrial economy. The crazy thing is, this wouldn't even be the only time Britain used its military might to forcibly establish its own trading hegemony in a region. Even setting aside their colonial takeover of India, Britain was already laying the groundwork for the invasion of a different Asian superpower, Imperial China. Because in the next century, Britain would illegally sell Indian opium to China in exchange for tea and get their entire population hopelessly addicted. But when the Chinese emperor banned opium, they would launch 2 separate wars that destroyed the Chinese economy and turned them into a nation of drug addicts. Honestly, it's even crazier than what happened with the pirates. You can watch my full video on the opium wars right here. Thanks so much for watching. Please support my channel by liking this video, get subscribed, and become a channel member to get early access to videos and exclusive content. I'll see you in the next one.